Welcome back into the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. We have an awesome episode today. We have Matt Harmon from Yahoo Sports. Obviously, everyone knows him as well from Reception Perception. I'm super excited to talk to this guy. Matt, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Thank you so much for having me. It's always good to start kind of turning the page to April. I don't know about you. You probably don't feel this way because you're so much more in the dynasty space than I am. And you're much more plugged in. I think especially this year, it's weird for two reasons for me. I feel like I'm playing catch up with prospects more than ever. Number one, it's because we had no combine this year. Me, after the NFL season, I'm really, I'm too consumed by NFL football already, with it being my job. Saturday has to be the day where I just basically tell football to get out of my life. It was so unfortunately, I don't really watch a lot of college ball unless it's big games. I know who Trevor Lawrence is and Devonta Smith, guys who are having great seasons. I'm obviously familiar, occasionally at a bar somewhere, I'll see a game, but I don't really know much about college football as the season's happening just because I'm not paying attention. So the combine is usually my intro to who are the wide receiver prospects for this season, and then everyone else along the way. This year with no combine, I feel like I was playing so much more catch up. Obviously, starting a business and a new website feels like playing even more catch up. So basically, it was and this free agency period for wide receivers was so big as well. So basically, getting those guys out of the way now, officially turning the page here to just draft prospects in April. I've been loving diving in on these guys, so I'm excited to talk today.
That's awesome, man. So before we get into the specific prospects, what made you want to start doing reception perception? It's something that has been huge in fantasy circles for years now. There might be people that, heaven forbid, might not even know Matt Harmon, but know reception perception. How did you come up with this? What was your motivation to make this happen?
Hey, I'm fine if a few people haven't heard of it. That means there's more folks out there to evangelize with the data, so that's all good. New users is always a good thing. So I'm fine if everybody's not familiar with it. But basically, it was exactly what you and I were talking about before we started recording, which is, on Sundays you're watching games, or even if you're trying to go back and do some scouting through the broadcast angle, it's very frustrating for wide receivers because they literally run off screen. Maybe 80 to 70% of a play development, you don't even know what a wide receiver is up to because, like I said, they literally run off screen. So, I realized, and I think this is just inherently something we all know playing fantasy, especially if you're playing fantasy, this to be the case. Wide receiver production is so dependent on other variables, outside factors, in order to get that thing going, right? Just to get a target is one thing. And I do think target is getting a target is a measure of quality, right? You did something right. More often than not, year over year, you're doing things right to get those targets, but to get a catch, a yard, a touchdown, you need other things to go right beyond just what the wide receiver is doing. So I wanted to essentially come up with a system that was going to give the wide receiver credit for the one thing that they can control, which is how often do you run good routes and how often do you get open? Essentially, it's trying to quantify the qualitative reality of route running, because we hear that stuff all the time, especially in scouting circles. This guy grades as a 6 out of 10 on my route running scale. It's well, what does that mean? Did the guy get open or did he not? So I wanted to kind of remove that barrier from football, the football lexicon and everything like that, just to essentially make folks smarter about wide receivers. And I know I've learned a lot along the way, and I hope other people have as well.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. All right, so let's get into these prospects. I know that you still have a lot of guys that you want to chart and scout, but we're going to talk about a few of the really big names in this class, the headliners. And this is a really great class, and I'm excited to hear you break down your thoughts on some of these guys. But first and foremost, who is your top guy right now? I know you have more guys to get through, but right now, who is your top guy in this class?
Yeah, I think it would be an upset if someone that I haven't charted yet became the top wide receiver in the class for me. That would be pretty wild. For me, I still think right now my wide receiver one is Jamar Chase. It's really tough between Chase and Devonta Smith for me. I think just because Chase fits the prototype of a wide receiver one more, I'm going to give him the slight edge there. And I mean, man, he's just such a fun prospect. Again, most of the time you look at any board, he's going to be the top wide receiver there. There's good reason for that. He just checks so many boxes. And I'll tell you this, man, I think from a separation angle, I know this was one thing that sort of he got knocked on, but I think he gets off press coverage really well. I've got good marks and reception perception for his success rate versus press across a variety of different routes. And the one thing that's just so impressive to him, or for me, when I'm watching him is this isn't really a hardcore like quantitative thing again, but it's just how much ground he eats up on those long developing vertical routes. I think he's going to be a great downfield receiver from day one in the NFL.
Yeah. And to look at all of the things that he can do and just how strong his hands are. He's got the good vertical. I mean, there's a lot to like there. So it's definitely not a surprise to see that he's your number one guy. Now, Devonta Smith, there are some that are going to have him right there with Chase and maybe even above Chase. What do you like about Smith, and what was the difference between the two that gave you that slight edge to Chase?
Yeah, I mean, I think no one's going to be surprised that the guy who's out here charting route running loves Devonta Smith, right? Because he just gets such easy separation off the line. I think, and this is actually an interesting thing, and we could really, unpack this, I think, as well. But I've been studying wide receivers at the NFL level for 7 seasons now. So since 2014, I've been charting data that long. There's no correlation in my database between weight or height or any combine metric and success rate versus press. Like it's all just basically the plot points. If you're doing like a scatter plot or a line graph, like they're all over the place, because basically, in my opinion, like, yeah, obviously it helps against physical play to be a bigger person, but how much, right? Like, I think if you're on the extreme end, like Devonta Smith, obviously it's a fair question. Like, I'm not going to sit here and just like wave the question away. I think you can use the BMI stuff, the weight and everything like that to sort of maybe put him in a different set of range of outcomes than maybe some of these other players. It's definitely a risk, right? It's a question mark in his scouting portfolio. But to me, getting off press coverage, it's all about technique. It's about quickness and it's about technique. That's the thing. Like, it's always interesting to me. Like, right? Do people think that just because you're 6'5", 240, like you're going to just push over the other defensive back?
Yeah, you're just going to run right through them. Just right through them, fullback style.
This is not how it works. Like, anytime you see these like sick route running clips that a big account will tweet out, it's never that they just like punch the other guy in the chest. It's all about the feet and the quickness and everything. Like, yeah, you can press like a guy like Tyra Kill. I hate to bring up like one of the best players in the league when making like a draft projection, but a guy like Tyra Kill, teams don't press him, but when they do, they can't get their hands on him, because he's that quick off the line of scrimmage. And I think he's very technically sound. Guys like Stephon Diggs, Antonio Brown. And I realize that Devonta Smith is in a different, body composition than some of these players, but everything comes back to technique and to discipline. And Smith already has so much of that in his portfolio. And I think the thing that's most impressive about him, it's not the route running, it's not the vertical playmaking. To me, it's how impressive he is at the catch point, right? Because I make this comparison, and I know people have feelings. Maybe you do too. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but comparing guys within the same school, right? So Calvin Ridley to Devonta Smith. Ridley, when he was coming out of Alabama in 2018, I charted him in reception perception. He was obviously awesome. To me, he was just like, yeah, there were questions. There were age questions, body composition questions, just like there are with Smith, but less extreme. Athletic testing questions. We don't have any of that data for Smith yet. There were questions, but to me, he was just a set it and forget it separator. Like, there was a very low chance that he was just going to be a total washout. Like, you could say maybe he wouldn't be that great. Maybe his ceiling wasn't that great. I think at this point, the ceiling questions have been answered for Ridley, but to me, he was just like a don't overthink it type of separator. I think Smith is that type of separator, but he's also better at playing through power and winning at the catch point of the contested game than Ridley was as a prospect, which is obvious. But I think that those guys are pretty comparable as players.
No, I think you bring up some really great points. I want to go back to off the line. And one of the things that I see Devonta Smith do a lot really, really well is how he utilizes his hands to get open too. Hand fighting is an underrated tactic. And there's another guy we'll talk about later in Rashad Bateman that I think he does some of that very well too. But I get the concerns of yeah, he's 170 pounds soaking wet. Like I
Yeah.
understand that, but I still haven't. And maybe you have some of this data, but one of the things that I haven't really seen much with the BMI discussion is what is the concern when they have a low BMI? Is it higher chance of injury? Is it lack of production? Is it like I feel like a lot of those things haven't really been answered well. I know CeeDee Lamb last year was like right on the cusp there of that BMI, and he's looking fantastic so far in Dallas. So I do think it's an interesting discussion to talk about that. But I'm with you on Devonta Smith. I think he's a much better contested catch guy, plays with much more physicality than you would expect at someone his size. Like you would think he would like shy away from contact, but he has no problem getting in there and mixing it up. Like I've been very, very impressed with him so far. So I think we do have two very, very, very talented prospects at the top of this class, but there's three more guys that we're going to talk about. And I'm interested to see, let's get specifically to Jalen Waddle. Jalen Waddle, teammate of Devonta Smith. We know that he's crazy fast. What other, because that's what you're going to hear about most is his speed. What are there other things to like about Jalen Waddle other than just like, hey, man, he's really fast and he's going to get open because he's fast?
Right. And it's interesting, too, because, there are some folks who prefer Jalen Waddle over Devonta Smith, and that's fine. I think Waddle's a really good prospect. But, one of these guys, there's this concern because of his BMI, like he might, like you said, he's just going to snap in half on the football field, even though he doesn't really have an injury history. Jalen Waddle, on the other hand, actually has, an injury history,
legitimate injuries.
Which is crazy. But I think Waddle, I just talked about Tyra Kill. I think those comparisons are worth it, not just because of the speed, because you mentioned it, like reception perception has been around for a long time. And there are plenty of like good calls out of the series that folks remember. One of my like more proud ones, I guess, like one of the things that I'm proud of is like winning on the margin sort of thing. Like, yeah, okay. Like there was the Allen Robinson breakout call, Stephon Diggs, all these guys. Right. But like coming out of Tyra Kill's rookie year, I thought reception perception proved some of its utility right then, because there were a lot of discussions is Tyreek Hill, just going to be the next like Cordero Patterson or the next Tavon Austin? Like he was mostly a gadget player as a rookie, but could he develop into more than that? Because this was a guy that was going in like the third or fourth round of fantasy drafts, despite the fact that he was that gadget player as a rookie. When you looked at his route charts and reception perception, his success rate versus press man coverage, it was like, yeah, he wasn't asked to run a lot of traditional routes, but when he did, he showed that he could separate at an above 80th percentile metric, which is like, that's what you're looking for in terms of being a future NFL star in the league. Just in terms of the thresholds, I put a bunch of information about this on the site. And I think Jalen Waddle shows those same early signs that he can be more than just a speed receiver. He didn't score out that great against press. He spends a lot of time in the slot, and I think he can probably be much like Tyreek Hill, a 40% ish slot player in the pros. Again, I think from a utilization standpoint, it's just a good comparison, even if he never has that type of career. But I think the things that are most impressive about Waddle beyond the speed is the underrated route technique. He's a very good separator. He's when the rookie reception perception metrics go up on the site, people are going to see that Waddle is very high against man coverage. He's pretty good against zone coverage. Again, some of the questions exist around press, but I also think one thing that's really good about him, despite the size, he's a very good contested catch receiver as well. He can really go up and get it. He's just a big time athlete.
He really is. And I think that's one of the things, and I can't remember off the top of my head your feelings on Ruggs, but I think that's one of the separators for me when I watched Ruggs last year.
Absolutely.
And I watched Jalen Waddle this year was, he was much more of a technician, but he was also able to go up, make that contested catch. You just didn't see that a lot from Ruggs. Part of it was he wasn't used in that way a ton, but that's something that you see often in Waddle's game, and why I think he can be more than just like, hey, go get it, go run a fly route.
I thought that Ruggs was so comparable to Mike Wallace, like from a deployment standpoint. That's the way you would want to use Henry Ruggs in the pros. Was Mike Wallace basically ran go routes. He ran some curls and the drag route, the slant route, get him in crossers over the middle of the field. The Raiders haven't quite figured that shock. The Raiders haven't quite figured all of that out yet with Henry Ruggs. But I think when you look at a guy like Jalen Waddle, you can use him in much more creative ways. Some of those deep posts and everything like that. I think he has a lot more upside as a route runner than Henry Ruggs did coming out of school.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. All right, let's get to Rashad Bateman. Bateman's a guy that I loved coming out of his what would have been his sophomore year. And then we had kind of this weird junior year here where he wasn't going to play. And then last second, he decided he was going to play. And then he didn't have quite the season that people were hoping and expecting, or that we saw in 2019 from him. But his name is all over the board. I've seen people say that he's a locked and loaded first rounder in the NFL draft. Other people that are like, he'll barely make it into the second round, or he'll barely be in the second round. I've seen him all over the place. What are your thoughts on Rashad Bateman?
Yeah, I really like this guy. I decided this was basically just kind of a recent decision too, because the pandemic has screwed up many things in our life, but the scouting process is different this year as well too. Like you mentioned, he also said like he was never felt quite right during 2020 because he actually had COVID. Like that was on a PFF podcast or something. He talked about that. He lost like 10 pounds or something like that. Jeez. He played a lot inside too. So I decided like basically how are we going to handle this from a charting angle? Because I sample 8 games for NFL players and for college players. He played 5 games last year, but in a very weird environment. For a guy like Rondale Moore, he played 3 and then decided I'm out of here. So for me, I actually decided to go back and look at their not their most recent season for these guys, but like their top season. So gotcha. Which is tough. I don't even know if this is the right, you can tell me if you think this is the right decision, not because it's difficult for a guy like Rondale Moore. His best season was like 3 years ago, Yeah,
it was when he was a freshman.
Right. But it's like, is that more useful data than the 3 games that he played last year? Because 3 games is just not enough. Like, I think you can get to 5, like Jalen Waddle's sample from 2020 is 5 games, and you're starting to get like pretty good useful data there, but 3 games is just not enough to me. So these are tough questions that I think we're all having to ask ourselves. But so basically, I say all this to say, I went in and I charted Rashad Bateman's 2019 season, and he's fantastic. And I think there's a very good parallel to a player that I think he's on this type of archetype. When Justin Jefferson coming out of school last year, it was, he played so much in the slot for LSU. Like, is he only ever going to be a slot receiver? But like, you go back and watch even him playing in the slot or when he played outside, this guy could get open at all levels. He could separate versus press. I had 0 questions about where Justin Jefferson could line up coming into last year. And I compared him to Keenan Allen. I think Rashad Bateman sort of on that same archetype, great separators, guys that you can play in the slot, but can absolutely function outside. I really like Bateman. I think that he can be, again, Keenan Allen, Justin Jefferson, these are like the best players, some of the best players at wide receiver in the NFL. But I think from an archetype deployment standpoint, they make a lot of sense. And maybe he could end up being a poor man's version of those players, maybe and I think he's a pretty good downfield player though, too, just like Jefferson was an underrated downfield receiver as a rookie, probably from a statistical standpoint, much better than Keenan Allen has been at any point. So I really like Bateman. I think he's a top 5 receiver for me. Again, still working through a lot of these guys, but I'm a big fan of his game, just solid separation across the board. And it's tough again, at some point, like if you can get open in the NFL, you're going to find a role, right? Like like very rarely when you look through the history of reception perception are these guys who get open, separate at all levels. They don't go on to fail or wash out of the league for the most part, unless you're Anthony Miller. Sorry to Anthony Miller, just catching a stray.
Oh, poor Bears. Poor Bears. All right. We got one last guy that we're going to talk about here. This is a name that, for you, I know how you talked about you kind of come into this process a little bit later, especially, years where we do have a combine, but this is a guy that hadn't really been talked about much as one of the top receivers until recently. There was some stuff on him as a freshman and, people were kind of intrigued, but, the Devy circles have talked about him, but he was never considered like a top prospect in this class until this year. And man, did he blossom this year, and things just looked amazing. His freshman, I believe it was his freshman, either freshman or sophomore campaign. He was there with, AJ Brown and DK Metcalf and DeMarcus Lodge, he's gone, but he was there with all those Ole Miss guys, but had a fantastic year this year. Going through looking at Elijah Moore, what are your thoughts on him?
Oh man, I love this guy. Like I was so impressed. Like he was someone I didn't really, like you said, didn't know too much about at all. You know, obviously I've heard of some of these top guys and had even seen a lot of people talking about Rashad Bateman, you know, leading into when I was going to start charting his sample out, but I hadn't really heard too much about Elijah Moore. Hadn't really heard, you know, too much pop about him, but man, he is so impressive. Gets open easily, you know, runs a lot of routes from the slot for sure. So I do have some, you know, questions about how can he win outside at the NFL level. I know there's not a great history of guys who are mostly slot receivers, you know, throughout their time in college and then like transition to the outside. I know we just talked about Justin Jefferson, and Rashad Bateman, but these guys had a history of big time production while being outside receivers. You know, with Elijah Moore, it's a little bit different. I also think though, you can say that a lot of teams right now at this point in college football, and this might be something that we talk about, you know, in 5 years, like looking back on it and being like, we should have started talking about this more. But a lot of colleges seem like they're doing what's really smart, which is just taking their top playmaker and lining them up inside, you know, with Jalen Waddle at Alabama. Like, you know, maybe that's another question for him too, because it makes sense, right? Like so much of the college game is over the middle of the field. So much of the college game is RPOs, and based on that, you know, run action and everything, there's just so much more, you know, you're just going to get a lot more free releases and a lot more wide open looks over the middle of the field coming out of the slot than you are playing X receiver for sure outside. So I think maybe Moore could be a bit more of an outside threat in the NFL, but even so, does it really matter? Everybody needs a good slot receiver, and especially someone explosive and that can beat man coverage like this guy can. Cause I do think for sure, if he lines up against man coverage, he's got good separation skills. I think, you know, again, to just sort of do the archetype comparison, I know I tweeted this out when I was watching him, and everybody really got a kick out of it. Like, you know, wide receiver gods forgive me, but like some of the things he does remind me of like early career Antonio Brown, like the way
I could totally see that.
The way he shuffles down and like hits that quick separation on some routes, like the dig route and stuff like that. I think that's a big one where he really shines. I also think too, this is something I remember seeing out of AB early in his career, you know, the way he would like pluck the ball off target throws and immediately become a run after catch threat. I think Elijah Moore does that extremely well. I think if we're being maybe more realistic, like maybe let's not compare him to one of the 5 best receivers that ever played pro football. I do think he can also fit into that Tyler Lockett, Doug Baldwin mold where it's like, yeah, they're slot receivers, but they're downfield big playmakers who can win in contested situations. I mean, Lockett has scored a ton of touchdowns because he's a great red zone receiver. I think maybe you could see something like that out of Moore as well in the pros too.
So with Elijah Moore, I'm with you that Antonio Brown comp. I know people gave you a really hard time about it, but when I saw it, it made a lot of sense. We're looking at somebody that has a very similar body size, you know, height, weight, that kind of thing. But also Elijah Moore isn't this like true burner, like, you know, we were talking about Waddle and Ruggs. Like, I don't think that's, you know, he has that elite of speed. We're talking definitely plus speed, but he wins much more often with his routes, with his great hands. So I could definitely see that. So I didn't think you were far off base, but obviously that's a ceiling comp, you know, but we have to have those sometimes. So
yeah. I'll tell you what though, man, I'm going to have a tough time not putting him. Like, I think he's pretty close with Jalen Waddle from a prospect standpoint. Like, I really, from what they could be in the NFL, I really am going to have a tough time not putting him as like my wide receiver 3 or 4 in this class. He's that impressive to me.
No, I'm with you. He keeps constantly moving up my board from somebody that I didn't know a ton about. He just keeps moving up and up. So I'm 100% on board. I'm going to have a hard time figuring out where to place him in all this because it's a difficult one. So when looking through, and let's assume this ends up being your top 5, obviously guys like, you know, Rondale Moore or Amon-Ra St. Brown or Terrace Marshall, like one of those guys could potentially hop in your top 5 as well. But let's assume this is the top 5 of this class. How do you feel about this class compared to some of the recent classes we've seen?
You know, I think this is a deep class. I think there's going to be a lot of guys that go in round 2 and round 3 that end up being producers. Taiwan Wallace out of Oklahoma State is another one I really like as well. He could end up being an instant impact in the pros. You know, we're just at a point right now, Garrett, where, you know, it's like every year going to be a good wide receiver class because we're coming off obviously 2020. And this is what's interesting too. And I know, again, you're much more plugged into like the dynasty space than I am. 2020 was expected to be a good wide receiver class, and it met and perhaps exceeded those expectations in year one of the experience. But 2018 and 2019 were not hyped up in terms of like top wide receiver classes. And frankly, like the stars of today and tomorrow at the NFL wide receiver position came out of like round 2 and 3, you know, Terry McLaurin, DK Metcalf, AJ Brown, like those guys are the top level players from that 2019 class. And I think that really just changed the board, like changed the landscape at wide receiver, where right now this position is stocked with good young talent, where I think, and especially since some of those, I don't know if this is the right lesson to learn from these last few classes, but I think because there are some big name guys that came out of 2019 and 2018 and are good starting receivers, and obviously 2020 as well, good starting receivers already in the NFL. I wonder if teams will look at this 2021 and 2022 and 2023, like these next few classes, and be like, let's pass on receiver and some of these premium picks and potentially try to get instant impact guys later. If you scout the position right, and you know, like the Steelers are always brought up as a team that like they always hit on wide receivers, which number one isn't true. They don't have some sort of like skeleton key, you know, Lima Swede and Sammy Coates exist like that. Those things happened, right? But it's not as if they have some skeleton key when scouting wide receivers. But I do think what they're really good at is understanding fit, deployment, and role. Like a guy with like Juju's key with that, Chase Claypool, Deontay Johnson. I think they found the right role for those players. I think that's what's key for these teams if they want to try to hit on some of these guys on day 2 and day 3 of this draft and beyond. Because right now at this point, like I said, it's a stock position. There's a lot of good young players and vets who have not aged out. You know, that 2014 class is still in its prime. Like Allen Robinson, Devontae Adams, these guys are certainly not on the back 9 of their career or anything like that. So it is just this position right now as a whole. I'm happy to be on the forefront of studying it.
No, it's such a wild time, man. It's such a wild time. It'll be interesting to see how 22 shakes out. I know one of their top receivers, probably the top receiver in the 22 class, George Pickens, tore his ACL. So, you know, we'll have to see how all of that ends up playing out. But we're going to wrap it up here. But before we sign out, tell us a little bit more about the new website and what's going on with all of that.
Yeah, receptionperception.com is the only place to find Reception Perception from now until the end of time, fingers crossed. My partner, James Coe, James Coe, we know him from the NFL Network days when we were teamed up together. Obviously, he's on DirecTV, Amazon. He has a ton of places. He's like the busiest person in the world. I have no idea how he has all of these hours in his day, but also to partner with me on this venture. We're going to be doing some exciting things. April this month is when the paywall is going to officially go up. April 15th is the date. So make sure you go to the site, then you subscribe. All throughout April, we're going to be dropping draft content on these guys that we mentioned and many more, to the point that before the NFL draft, April 26th, we'll have a database on at least 10 to 15 prospects, basically breaking these guys down, heading it from a route running angle. Everything you want to know about wide receivers, you're going to be able to find it at receptionperception.com for our subscribers. And obviously then going into the NFL season, this I think will be good for your audience. In previous years with previous partnerships, Reception Perception was always dropped on one date. It was always with the footballers, and their draft kit always came out on June 1st. This iteration of the project will be dropping an earlier look at some of these 2020 guys in mid-May. So if people can get some early looks to it, also subscribers will get up-to-date articles. So, if I go in and I chart, like last year, it was, how like when you get a take and like you really want to share it, but you can't all the way yet. It was like, if I went in and like charted Terry McLaurin, I'm like, this guy just had a great rookie season. Like I want to tell people to go buy him right now, but the draft kit doesn't come out till June 1st. This year for subscribers, we'll be able to give you up-to-date information like that. So if I do chart someone, I like them, we're going to go put them right on the website. So all these Dynasty players out there will know, all right, let me go make some trade offers real quick on the low. So I think people will enjoy that part of the project.
Us Dynasty folks, we'll be all about that, because we're the guys that we're trying to draft as early as we can. It's like like the first round just ended of the NFL draft. They're like, okay, let's start up our startup draft, and so we're crazy with that. So the earlier the better. Definitely the Dynasty folks will love that. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, spending time talking to the Dynasty folks here over at Dynasty Nerds, and I hope you have a great day, man.
Thanks so much, Garrett. I really appreciate it.